to hear everybody for this conversation. So, and hopefully we will not have that problem with the other participants. Thanks for joining this Jewish Currents webinar on the crisis in Jerusalem.
Oh, Mahmoud, I think your volume just went really low, so if you might want to put the mic closer. I'm sorry, Mahmoud, Peter.
Okay. All right. Shoot.
That's better.
Is this better?
Slightly.
Yes. Now you're good.
Okay. Is this better?
Yes.
Okay. So again, my apologies. We have a really extraordinary group of panelists to talk about the crisis in Jerusalem. Our first guest is Mahmoud Muna, who is known to many as the bookseller of Jerusalem, a cultural icon in the city. In addition to running the city's main bookshop, he regularly organizes events on various literature and cultural themes, including the Kalimat Literature Festival. His interests lay somewhere between identity and culture, behaviors and language. When Mahmoud is not reading, he is writing for local and international outlets on current affairs with special focus on the role of culture as a form of resistance. Dr. Judith Oppenheimer is an activist and researcher of Jerusalem. For the past decade, she has served as executive director of Ir Amim, an Israeli NGO working for an equitable and stable Jerusalem with an agreed-upon political future. Diala Shamas is a staff attorney at the Center for Constitutional Rights, where she works on challenging government and law enforcement abuses perpetrated under the guise of national security, both in the U.S. and abroad. Prior to joining the Center for Constitutional Rights, Diala was a clinical supervising attorney and lecturer in law at Stanford Law School and senior staff attorney supervising the Creating Law Enforcement Accountability and Responsibility Project at CUNY Law School. I'm Peter Beinart. I'm editor-at-large at Jewish Currents. Mahmoud, let me start with you. Can you just help people understand what has happened over the last week or so that has gotten us to this point where there seems to be escalating violence across Israel-Palestine?
Thank you, Peter, and thank you for this opportunity, and good evening, everyone else. It's Peter, it's one of the dangers we always in is to always think that the clock has started ticking just only last week. The question, rather than why not now, is actually how come this didn't happen last year? We've been in this pressure cook in Jerusalem, and of course in the Palestinian territory, occupied territory, for the last years now, with absolutely no political solution. No fresh ideas, no changes, and oppression is only increasing, racism is only increasing, and people are getting pushed, and just what happened last week is a series of circumstances that I think coincidentally all came together to bring us to this threshold now where we are in. I'm not surprised, to be honest. I mean, it's people who lived in the city have always said, how long this is going to be in for, and it just happened in the beginning of Ramadan. Of course, there is outside, if you like, reasons. There's internal reasons. There's the failure of the Palestinian elections. There's a failure of Israel coming together in a political unified government, or just government even. That is the outside, but internally, whoever were close to the Palestinian life in Jerusalem, but also in the Palestinian territory, will know that we are things were boiling under the surface.
Thank you, Mahmoud. Diala, you know Jerusalem very, very well, and maybe I can just ask you to pick up a little bit where Mahmoud left off, which is talking about the lives of Palestinians in East Jerusalem, the pressure that they are under, and why that has made this kind of a moment like this, why it doesn't surprise Mahmoud that it emerged.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for having me on here. I think the piece of my bio that was missing is that I'm actually also a Jerusalemite, and I am a holder of a Israeli Jerusalem residency card. And I'll get into a little bit of that too, but that's really from the perspective from which I'm speaking with you all today. What's happening in Sheikh Jarrah has to be placed in this broader context, as Mahmoud noted, right? And the root cause of what's happening in Sheikh Jarrah has been Israel's systematic dispossession of Palestinians in Jerusalem, as well as elsewhere in Palestine. And we talk a lot about Sheikh Jarrah as emblematic of the ongoing Nakba. So what started in 1948 in the displacement of Palestinians, so many of the families in Sheikh Jarrah are actually Palestinian families that were uprooted and forced out of their homes in 1948, were then resettled across the, in the eastern part of the city as refugees, and now are facing a second and in some cases third displacement. So to look at this as a moment in time is not an adequate way to understand what's happening. But what's happening in Sheikh Jarrah, in addition to sort of being part of this longer story of ongoing dispossession of the Palestinian people since 1948, is part of a policy, an Israeli policy, that's explicitly intending to maintain a, quote, solid Jewish majority, or euphemistically called maintaining a demographic balance in Jerusalem. And so that happens in a range of ways, not just through what's being called the eviction proceedings in Jerusalem, but also through all sorts of forms of bureaucratic violence that are less visible and certainly never covered in mainstream media. One of the most evident ways of this bureaucratic violence is regulation over residency rights. And we all know a lot about this. Any Jerusalemite that you sit with will have stories after stories of how the Ministry of Interior subjects them to a really Kafkaesque set of policies to prove, even though we are a native and indigenous population to the city, that we must constantly prove that our, quote, center of life is in Jerusalem, in order to maintain our right to continue accessing our city of birth. And so, we have to show up to the Ministry of Interior with electricity bills, all sorts of, parking tickets, what else we can muster to prove that we in fact continue to live in a city that we were born in. And essentially what that is because it's paired with a policy of removing these residency rights from Palestinian Jerusalemites, essentially rendering us stateless. So that bureaucratic policy of requiring Palestinian Jerusalemites, who, again, just for context for the audience, Jerusalem was occupied along with the rest of the West Bank and Gaza in 1967, and is internationally recognized as occupied territory. But Israel considers it annexed and extended residency rights, but not, of course, citizenship rights to Palestinian residents of Jerusalem. And so the center of life policy is really just uniquely imposed on Jerusalem's Palestinian population. And it's paired with all sorts of other forms of policies that make life very difficult for Palestinians to remain in Jerusalem, right? You can't get a building permit if you want to build, to simply expand your home to make room for a growing family. It's impossible to get licenses for some businesses. Home demolitions are a way of enforcing the lack of permitting system. I'm sure that Judith can explain a lot more about these various layers that all together form a policy of systematically dispossessing and removing Palestinians from the city in order to, quote, maintain a so-called demographic balance, which essentially amounts to ethnic cleansing. Human Rights Watch has recently called this a policy of apartheid, or a system of apartheid, looking at both the system of laws in Jerusalem as well as outside of Jerusalem in the West Bank and the rest of Israel. And together, collectively, looking at a range of these policies, they reach the conclusion that it amounts to a system of apartheid. So I'll stop there.
Judith, I wanted to turn to you. There has been there's been a fair amount of attention in recent days to the settler organizations that have been involved in trying to evict these families from Sheikh Jarrah, and also the kind of the Jewish extremists who have been kind of marching and often threatening Palestinians. And I wonder if you can talk a bit about that movement, that ecosystem that we've been seeing playing itself on the ground in recent days.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you for the opportunity to explain, because I think that for many Israelis, and maybe also Jews around the world and in the United States, it's hard to understand the issue. First, because it's very, very complicated, but also because what the Israeli right wing says and the government and not only that they support it, it is also supported by the Israeli court. I mean, the Israeli court has been ruling again and again in favor of the evictions of these Palestinian families from the home. And what they actually say is that their hands are tied because this is the law. So if it's all legal, and what is not okay about it. And if the courts approve of these evictions again and again and again, and we haven't seen even one case in which the court says, no, this is not working. I mean, at most they are postponing, and now they're asking for the Attorney General to, which is new. I mean, but yet, I mean, what the basic argument all the time is that this is the law and this is legal. The issue is that, as Dalia explained so well before, that the law is discriminatory in nature. There is the settler organization are working to evict Palestinians from their homes based on two legal mechanism on two laws. One was established in 1950, and it was meant to it was passed in order to expropriate all the properties that were left by the Palestinian refugees. And what could have been explained, I mean, still quite, it's difficult to explain, out of, you know, what many countries did during their emancipatory wars and under a war and under emergency. It is an emergency law that has never been expired. How can you explain that it is still enacted in 2021 when this country is more than 70 years old? If this is not enough, in 1970, after the 1967 war, not only that the 1950 law was, and there were several recommendations by attorney generals over the years to postpone the 1950 law. Instead, a new law was passed in 1970 that allowed Jews to reclaim their properties in East Jerusalem, those that were left in 1948. So this worked in a very asymmetrical, I would call it, I mean, there is no other way than to say discriminatory way in which Palestinians, Jews can reclaim their properties from before 1948, but Palestinians, those who lost their properties in West Jerusalem in 1948 cannot reclaim them, but are subject to lose their properties again now due to the 1970 law. I hope I'm not making things too complicated, and I will try to make it very simple. There is a double machinery in which Palestinians are losing their properties, and a double machinery in which Israelis are compensated for the lost properties from before 1948. They received another property after 1948, and now they can claim their property. If this is not enough, it's not even a machinery in which the original owners receive their properties. It's rather a settler organization on representing a kind of a general subject of a Jewish subject that lost properties in 1948, reclaiming properties. So it's not even a returning lost properties to their original owners, but purely a mechanism in which settler organization evicts Palestinians from their home and take them over.
Thank you. Thanks, Judith. This is very helpful. Mahmoud, I want to just go to you. You mentioned just in passing in your first answer the fact that the Palestinian elections had been delayed, and I wonder if you can situate this moment in Palestinian politics and maybe talk a little bit about what you think some of the political dynamics are, what political dynamics are driving it, and if you have any thoughts about what some of the political consequences in terms of the nature of Palestinian resistance may be, as this situation unfolds.
Yes, I will. If you just allow me, Peter, to just refer and comment a little bit about what Judith and Dalia have said, and just to frame it
Sure.
a little bit for our audience.
Sure.
I think one of the why this is becoming an opportunity actually for Palestinians to finally mobilize again and unite and to have some decent international support behind it is we're having three frameworks that are colluding in the same time, and I think that's a work of coincidence. Nevertheless, it's something to understand. One, we have the national element. Second, we have the religious element. And the third, we have the legal elements. And we have also three relatively corresponding flashpoints. So in the Damascus Gate, we have the national elements. We have Israel trying to limit access to a public space, to a place that is very much Palestinian, very much Jerusalemite, actually. Damascus Gate is a theatric-looking venue where people socialize, produce art, and so on. And Israel, by closing part of that plaza at the beginning of this crisis, have been seen as a trespassing on this national identity of the Palestinians within Jerusalem, right? I want to emphasize that. That was felt more like a problem with a Jerusalemite, if you like. And people who resisted that was basically the people in Jerusalem. We didn't really see people coming from Haifa to demonstrate with us in Damascus Gate. Let's just be honest about this. We didn't see Arabs around the world demonstrating with us around Damascus. It was really very local to the Jerusalemite. And the resistance focused on the outcome, or the demand was opening up the square, and that was achieved after 13 days. Then we had the second, if you like, dimension, which is the legal international law kind of dimension, embodied in the story of the Sheikh Jarrah, which is you did have expanded on speaking. And here we have an issue where Israel is basically being Israel and acting above international law and above everything that we know is legal or common sense. And although actually the affected, if you like, the impact is only on 28 families, 28 houses in Sheikh Jarrah, the people around the world, including Palestinians, have seen this as an attack on their legal rights now, not their national per se. Of course, all these things are intertwined, but here it was a much more legal case. And that was an opportunity for some organizations on the Israeli left, as well as international organizations. And more now we're witnessing even the international celebrity kind of tagging on and jumping on the case of the Sheikh Jarrah, because it's not, yes, it's true, it is Palestinian, and yes, it's nationally to do with the Palestinians, but it's bigger than that. It really represents an issue with international and legal status. The third flashpoint is, guess what? It's Al-Aqsa Mosque. And that's, yes, of course, it's also legal and national, but it's more religious now. That's an attack on the religious identity of the Palestinians. It's an attack on a holy site. And that mobilized much more the Arab world, mobilized much more the Islamic world. And the resistance is, of course, on masses and on people, and mostly praying. I mean, people in my city were trying to wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning to go to the mosque to pray. So then their mere presence in the mosque as a religious activity, praying there, will constitute as a resistance to the incursion by Israeli settlers into the mosque. So what happened here, you have three almost different dimensions. You have, of course, intertwining issues, but nevertheless, you have everyone in Jerusalem who's either nationalist or religious or liberal. He had one cases to rally around. So I look at my friends around me in Jerusalem, and then I can see people who are a bit more religious. They'll tell you, tonight I'm going to Al-Aqsa Mosque, actually. People who are a bit on the left, they say, I'm going to go to the Sheikh Jarrah, right? People who are really not very political, but they feel like this is their Jerusalem and Israel is taking part of it. They also, I'm going to go to Damascus Gate. I'm going to take my family and I'm just going to be in Damascus Gate. I'm going to do my shopping in Damascus Gate. And I think this is the fortunate for Palestinians, unfortunate for Israel, that it's not just one segment of the Palestinian society, not in Jerusalem and not in the rest of Palestine. And now we have now we have to see how Palestine, essentially historic Palestine, all the way from the north to the south, is all rallying around the current wave of whatever you want to call it. I like to call it shake off, but because they're finding something in it that talks to them, whether they're liberal or religious or just nationalist. Now, to go to your question, the canceling is kind of actually ironic as well. The Palestinian Authority, probably the most irrelevant body in the entire discussion happening these days, is actually canceled the Palestinian election because of Jerusalem. And this joke is now, is actually there is no need for election in Jerusalem. The people in Jerusalem have already voted, and they voted to be the leader of their own cause and not to give their representation to quasi-corrupt proxy bodies represented by the Palestinian Authority. So actually, people in Jerusalem, and I think many Israelis, and even some of the Palestinian political parties in the beginning, they tried to jump on the wagon and kind of direct this wave as if it is a demonstration against canceling the election or not allowing Israel to do election in Jerusalem. I think talking of Palestinian election now is probably the most irrelevant subject again. In fact, the Palestinian Authority has turned itself suddenly irrelevant. I will close by saying, just imagine if the Palestinian Authority really understood Jerusalem well, and if they really read Jerusalem well, they would have waited for canceling the election just 1 week. If the election was canceled yesterday, just imagine the scenario that the election was canceled yesterday, not 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago now. And imagine how much the Palestinian Authority will become relevant to the story, because it will capture the story, if you like, and it will be, okay, because Jerusalem is shaking off, because Palestinians is being oppressed, and because you're not allowing us to do election in Jerusalem, we're going to cancel it. On the contrast, the Palestinian Authority really did have nothing in terms of reading the street in Jerusalem. The day the election was canceled, already Damascus Gate was already boiling. I'm just looking at the mirror now and looking at the Palestinian Authority itself and saying they really had no reading actually on what's happening in Jerusalem. If they did, they would have been in a much better position. But now the Palestinian election is something of the past. We have no dates. We don't know what's going to happen. Even if it's happened in Jerusalem, to be honest, without actual possibilities for the Palestinian Authority to do anything in Jerusalem, election is pointless. That's why my expectation was that less than 10% of Palestinians in Jerusalem would have voted anyway.
Thank you. That's extremely helpful, comprehensive. Diala, I wanted to turn to you. Mahmoud was talking about the role of the Palestinian Authority and in or non-role in some ways in this uprising that's emerged based in Jerusalem. I wanted to ask you about the other big Palestinian political player, which is Hamas, based in Gaza, which has entered into the fray with this rocket fire. Again, that was aimed at Jerusalem, but also, more broadly, and of course, Israel also attacking into Gaza itself. And I wonder if you can talk about what you think Hamas's political strategy is here, and how and what role Hamas is playing in this kind of broader political uprising rebellion that we're seeing.
I mean, you can't really talk about the situation in Gaza without also talking about the fact that it's been under a 15-year blockade imposed by the Israeli government, and that is essentially a population that is under siege. And so, I can't really comment too much on the sort of thinking or the strategizing behind the Hamas government, but I can certainly comment on the the way that from right now I'm sitting in New York digesting US news and sort of stunningly kind of shocked at how this is like the main thing that everybody is focusing on, when in fact Jerusalem has been on fire for a month at this point. And also this doesn't just happen a week ago, but we've had Israeli right-wing parties and movements marching through East Jerusalem for weeks and over a month, brutalizing Palestinian residents, storming the old city, that kind of thing. So I think that we are a little bit too fixated on what the Hamas government always says and does, and maybe Mahmoud has additional kind of like analysis of what the political calculus there might be. I was hoping to speak a little bit about another player in this story, which I think is really important for the American audience, and particularly Jewish American audience, to take note of, and that's the role of not just the US government, but that's a big elephant in the room, of course, the sort of continued unconditional diplomatic and material support that the US government provides to the current Israeli government, but also Jewish American so-called philanthropic support that directly is behind the settler enterprise, the settlement enterprise, and specifically the Sheikh Jarrah proceedings, right? And if we look at some of the money that is going to support and to fund and actually initiate some of these so-called eviction proceedings in Sheikh Jarrah, that's actually traceable right here to New York City. New York City has, it houses the Central Fund for Israel, which is a 501c3 registered nonprofit whose primary purpose is to fund the Israeli settlement enterprise. And many of its grantees are active in Sheikh Jarrah, including the Israel Land Fund, which has been posting, as a so-called real estate matter, homes in what it calls Nahalat Shimon, which is the term that the settlers use for Sheikh Jarrah, for sale. And so we have to be cognizant of our, by us, I mean now Americans, role in this story, right? Why is this completely unregulated, unscrutinized, despite the fact that it's direct participation in internationally unlawful conduct? The Biden administration has been completely silent on this, has spoken much more loudly when there were some rockets fired from Gaza, but has been, really just doubling down on, at best, both sidism. And I think that's something that we really need to be interrogating here in light of our direct involvement and complicity, whether it's, and people we should be directing ourselves to are the Biden administration, but also city and state administrators and agencies that are responsible for overseeing some of these nonprofits. And so I would really just like to bring that into this conversation too.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me the fundamental kind of deep dishonesty of the Biden administration's policy is that essentially what they want to say that they don't really want to be involved in Israel-Palestine. They want to focus their attention on China and other parts of the world, right? But of course, they are deeply and profoundly involved, right? Because they're giving Israel all this unconditional support. So they want to be able to basically give Israel unconditional support and not have to bother with it bother with it other than that, right? But it's of course it's America's support that is partly responsible for these conditions that now we're seeing playing out the way they are.
Well, just briefly, sorry, Peter, to interrupt you.
Yeah, go ahead.
But just, the Biden administration's own stated goal of returning to a sort of rule of law based and rights-based international engagement is directly inconsistent with their approach with it's sort of the exception is Israel. So they are carrying that message in all these other contexts, but completely not in this context. And unfortunately, that's not a break with the past. It's not a break with the Trump administration, certainly, but it's also something that we saw a lot in the Obama administration. But in light of the complete complicity of the Trump administration, to the point where there were high-level settler leadership in the Trump administration, right? It sort of requires the Biden administration to do more than say nothing, to actively distance itself from, at very least, that very recent history, if not more.
Right. Yudit, I want to go to you and to talk about the Israeli government. Israel has been trying unsuccessfully to form a government in a kind of political stasis now for a couple of years, with its inability to form governments that can really endure in repeated elections. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about if you think the Israeli government has a strategy for managing this rising this kind of uprising right now, what it is, and how what you see is this interaction between Palestinian uprising and this kind of Israeli political stasis, malaise, incapacity.
Thank you, Peter, for this action. So the first question that needs to be asked is whose government? You know,
Right.
But since it's been Netanyahu's government in different form for the past who knows how many years, and also in the last 2 years, it's definitely, first of all, you know, the Netanyahu's government to be blamed. But I think that, and I wonder if my colleagues here will agree with me, what we have seen in the past few weeks in Jerusalem. On the one hand, Palestinians feel very much the hard line of the Israeli government, and at the same time, many issues on all the issues that we discuss, including decision made by the High Court. But on the other hand, what we have seen on the ground is that many issues are actually being left to the better and usually the worst judgment of the police. So what we call the spirit of the high commander, I mean, I'm translating for Hebrew, namely that the spirit of the leader and the one and only one is very much felt on all the policy on the ground. But at the same time, the police was taking independent decisions that were only removed at the last minute, if at all, by the government. But this policy of allowing the police to do and to make its own judgment and to act on the ground as in any way possible and in their liking, and only respond at the last minute when the crisis is not just the last minute, but actually is already out there. Only responding that it's been Netanyahu's policy for a long time. And when it comes to Jerusalem, I mean, it's a policy. I mean, when you allow the police to act as it's act and to act in a very violent way, and in a very and this is a policy. And I would like to, and sometimes it's a policy because the sort of high commander is preoccupied with other issues, but sometimes because this is how he wants he wants the force on the ground, and he wants the police to respond. And I would like to add to what was said before, and that, I think, connects all these issues that you've just raised about the police behavior, about the policy, about the Hamas, and about what's going on the ground in East Jerusalem. I think that what's going on now with the Hamas and this mini war happening in the southern part or coming from the Gaza border actually diverts our attention. That in all the sites that Mahmoud so brilliantly explains, the struggle, the Palestinian struggle, is a non-violent struggle. And what we have seen in all of these sites, and particularly in Sheikh Jarrah, this is a non-violent struggle at its best. It's the residents together with the supporters now from all around East Jerusalem, which is a very unique situation, and also from all around the Palestinian sector within Israel. And with some leftist supporters too, Israeli and international, are leading a non-violent struggle per se, and are treating with a very violent police, by a very violent police. I've been there yesterday. I saw the skunk water spray. I mean, just days before Eid al-Fitr, it stays there in the air. It actually penetrates into the homes. That's how people in Sheikh Jarrah will be celebrating Eid al-Fitr with this horrible smell, horrible in the air, with police horses, with the shock bombs, I mean, it's all. I mean, in there was a very reasonable, non-violent demonstration going on there. At the same in Damascus Gate, where actually people were demonstrating day after day, holding a non-violent methods in order to say, this is our space, this is our public space. So if you ask about what I think that the message behind all this and what Palestinians are feeling is that it's an ongoing attack on their home in Jerusalem, on both their private and collective home in Jerusalem, and they respond as in the way people are, as people defending their home.
Thank you for that. Mahmoud, I wanted to ask you if you could just talk about what, if you can put this in historical context. We think about the first Intifada, the second Intifada. First of all, are we getting to the point where we're thinking about this in that trajectory as an Intifada is yet relevant? And I'm also interested in maybe how you would just compare the political dynamics now in Palestinian organization and resistance to those two previous moments.
Yes, that's great. And maybe I can comment a little bit about the very important subject on which Judith was ending her conversation with.
Please.
I mean, it's clearly that every 20 years we have shake-off in Palestine. And that's not really rocket science to understand. This is a generation. A generation comes in, it tries, you could argue it fails or it doesn't deliver. You get this years of despair and hopelessness, and then another generation picks up. I mean, when I go to, and I'm not going to give away my age very quickly, but when I go to Damascus Gate and to Sheikh Jarrah now, I feel I am old for the generation that is leading this movement. And part of it is you really just want to enjoy and see what people coming up with ideas and let them lead that way, and hopefully that they may have better ideas than what I or my previous generation had. So as long as there is occupation, as long as there is oppression, as long as Israel continue to have the cake and eat it too, I can promise you on this Zoom that every 20 years or so, you're going to have a wave of Palestinians rising up. That's just not specially about Palestinian. That's just what oppressed people around the world have taught us. Every generation will come up and will try to shake off the oppression. And to connect that with what Judith was speaking, especially about this parallel violence and non-violence. I mean, we can, and maybe particularly me, I should, the fact that I live in Jerusalem and speaking to you from Jerusalem now, I should really adopt to this passive, it will be nice to all of this for be non-violent and so on. But the fact is, in the first Intifada, in the second Intifada, and now, different people will find their way of resisting differently, and that's what it is. I mean, what would be the magical way for people in Gaza, 1.7 locked in a prison, pretty much, to act peacefully? I mean, there is a very little means of them. I can act peacefully. I can go and sit in, like what people have done, by the way, in road number 1 a week ago, to go and sit in and block the street between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. You can do that because I can go to street number 1. But how are you going to ask the people in the West Bank, for example, and the people in Gaza to resist peacefully in the way that we can in Jerusalem, or we can in Haifa, or we can in Naqab, and so on? So although I remain a supporter of non-violent popular resistance, especially for people who are in Jerusalem, we also have to be a little bit honest with ourselves and say that's a luxury that not everyone has, and not everyone accepts, and not everyone can see that only popular resistance will deliver and will get people free. I think in the cases of Jerusalem, in the 3-4 flashpoints we had in Jerusalem, popular resistance was perfect, and it was the right thing to do. I also have to be honest, Judith, and I think we have to be honest with ourselves. A lot of people in Damascus Gate were actually chanting for Hamas to send missiles to Israel. Let's just be honest. This is an honest conversation today. That was the premise. So to just say that people in Damascus Gate were just doing peaceful demonstration, well, they did peaceful demonstrations. But they also were not exactly against intervention from Hamas, which is officially pretty much, or non-officially, is the military for the Palestinian people today. Israel is the strongest army in the Middle East and has all the power that it has. Palestinians don't have an army, so they perceive, whether we agree with that or not, that's not the conversation here, but the people perceive Hamas to be their military support, especially in the absence of any Arab or Islamic or any actually challenge militarily for Israel from regional or international place. I think it was going perfectly nice in Jerusalem, to be honest, and I'm still mixed opinion about if Hamas intervention was good or not. But I'm also aware that when Palestinians were suffering for the last 30, 40 years of really a lack of leadership, when actually Israel have contributed actively to really corrupt the established leadership and not to allow any decent leadership for Palestinians to come up. And when the international community, and America is one of that, by not putting pressure on the BA and in Israel to implement a Palestinian election last month, we really have little saying on saying, well, we wish that happened and wish that happened. It's the people movement, and people choose. And people in Gaza choose their own way, and people in Gaza choose their own way. Hamas is a political party. It's represented among Palestinians. We should not put our head in the sand. It's represented, and they have their way of resisting. We like it, we don't like it, we probably don't like it, but they are a legit part of the Palestinian makeup. In fact, they are strong representation of the Palestinians, whether we like it or not, again. So I think we should just be a little bit more, if we in one way saying this as leaderless, Palestinian-led, people-led movement, then we should also accept that people are going to make their choices, and that's how it's going to be. If we wanted to try to control it, then we can't call it any more spontaneous people-led, and then we are down through another lane, if you like. I hope that just kind of take the conversation a little bit into different areas, and maybe maybe I didn't cross many lines here, but I think it's important to be really honest on this discussion of violence and non-violence.
Yeah. No, thank you for that.
If I can comment
Sure.
on this, I think that non-violence is power. It's also of power. And if I judge by the successful struggles that East Jerusalemites have led over the past years, there were. I mean, the non-violence struggles rise. Beyond all the magnometers, and I think it's important to highlight the content of the characteristic of non-violent popular resistance that are very, very powerful, that characterize this struggle, and these days too.
May I just jump in on this and
Please,
take your question?
Please.
I mean,
Go ahead, Diala.
This debate over, how Palestinian Jerusalemites can resist, I think needs to be put into context of two major things. One, as Mahmoud was saying, is the complete abandonment of Palestinian Jerusalemites, not only by the Palestinian Authority, but also by the rest of the Arab world, as well as the international community, right? We have seen, do not forget, very recently, efforts, what are called normalization efforts by Arab countries, essentially, and by the Trump administration, essentially recognizing as lawful, right, crossing this red line, the annexation of the occupied territory, including East Jerusalem, right? So I think this idea of complete abandonment and lack of leadership is a really important one to note. And yes, there has been such a long history of nonviolent resistance. But note that it's also illegal to fly an Israeli, a Palestinian flag in Jerusalem. Palestinian efforts to organize cultural institutions in East Jerusalem have been suppressed brutally, right? Offices raided, people imprisoned for organizing in East Jerusalem. It's nonviolent, so-called nonviolent resistance and mere existence actually in East Jerusalem is met with violence. And so that's a really important piece of context. And the other one is just as a reminder of all the ways in which Palestinians organizing and advocacy, whether it's on the ground in Jerusalem and the West Bank or abroad, regardless of whether they're violent or nonviolent, are met with complete silencing and shunning, right? Palestinians in Gaza marched every Friday for years as part of the Great Return March to demand the right to return, and got zero attention, right? Putting their lives at risk. Palestinians have called for a boycott and are being called anti-Semitic when they do so, both by the Israeli government as well as by US institutions. And so this questioning of policing how Palestinians can and cannot respond to a situation where, let's not forget, they are occupied. They are a civilian population that is under military occupation, including in East Jerusalem, I think can't be disregarded. And we've also, obviously, this is in the context of also exhausting all judicial avenues available for decades, right? Whether it's through the Israeli courts, and we're seeing where that's leading the families, and has consistently led the family, people trying to vindicate their rights through Israeli courts is something that has not been provided any meaningful change in the situation on the ground, or through the international, avenues that are available to them. We saw that Palestinians' efforts to go to the International Criminal Court are essentially criminalized, certainly by the Israeli government, but also by the US government of the Trump administration, a great cost. So even when we try to turn towards judicial institutions, we're also told to sit down and shut up.
I think just Peter, just to comment on this quickly, I think it's just on that discussion. I think it's, to make myself very clear here, I think I feel much more invited to nonviolent activities, and I feel like I can actually participate, and violence doesn't really invite me as such to participate. There's no question about that. But I think we lost the intellectual, the leaders, of the street in Jerusalem, if I speak about myself at least. If this is led by the people in Jerusalem, by the young people in Jerusalem, we're speaking about people who are born above the 1990s. This is Gilles Oslo. This is the Oslo generation. They are leading these movements, and the one who really have contributed all these what we might want to call success, or very small successes in Jerusalem, nevertheless success in Jerusalem. I think we have very little space for opinions, to be honest, on how we should dictate to tell people how to resist. I'm not in Gaza, and I don't live in Gaza, and I never in fact been in Gaza. So I find myself unable to really comment about how the people in Gaza should resist. We're dealing here with an occupation of Palestine. We're not dealing here with the occupation of Jerusalem. So if it is the occupation of Jerusalem, then the people in Jerusalem will find their ways. But if it's the occupation of Palestine, then I think every Palestinian, whether in Gaza or the West Bank or Jerusalem or diaspora, has their own saying on how this conflict should be tackled.
Mahmoud, I wanted to stick with you for 1 minute and then go to you, Deet. You talked about this younger generation, particularly in Jerusalem. I just wonder if you'd say something about what distinguishes it, in terms of experience and outlook, from previous Palestinian generations.
Yes, these are young people who have lived in the last 20 and so years in what Israel tried to promote as an integrated East Jerusalemite into West Jerusalem. This is the young people that play, some Israelis like to say that they play Hebrew music, they speak Hebrew, they do their shopping in Israel, they work in Israel. This is the language that's often referred to these young people who Israel thought they have won. This is the people that Golda Meir referred to in the old days, that the old will die and the young will forget. These are people surprising us. They're really surprising me, to be honest. These people that are, they again, I don't want to feel talking badly about them, but these are people who are not like the most nationalist among Palestinian society. They are not people who have studied in universities the history of Palestine or whatever. These people who have lived the experience of this failed peace process, a process that Israel tried to take the best advantage of turning it around to its advantage. At one point, they had enough. They actually, a lot of them are arguing a lot of what we've seen in these images and these videos, and if you're in the street, you'll also witness it, this one-to-one kind of even close challenge that they're putting forward to the Israeli police and Israeli soldiers in the street. It's something that is really astonishing. I never came 2 meters close to an Israeli police or Israeli army. My fear distance was 2 meters at least. That's my generation. The new generation have broke that fear line, and they're standing very close to Israeli soldiers. The same Hebrew that they taught by working in West Jerusalem is they're using now to argue and to demand their rights from Israelis. So this is a different generation that's basically a result of 2 intifadas and a failed peace process. And they see in themselves the ultimate power to challenge Israel, and they're putting up a pretty good challenge, to be honest, of what we've seen in Jerusalem. Now, compare this to the West Bank, you have a completely different story, because the same generation in the West Bank is probably have never met an Israeli soldier, because they're living in the big prison that's called in the West Bank. And compare that generation to the guys in Gaza, there's a completely different generation. I mean, I talked recently to a guy in Gaza who's 22 years old. He said, I never saw a Jew in my life. I want to repeat that to you. He said, I never saw a Jew in my life, face to face. And I was like, well, at least you saw soldiers. He was like, not even soldiers. They come and they bomb us from the skies and we don't even see them. So compared to a Palestinian 22 years old, who's probably every day is walking into West Jerusalem, he's probably working in West Jerusalem, he's probably socializing somewhere in West Jerusalem and so on. It's a completely different generation. This kind of defragmentation of the Palestinian reality today, the wall, Gaza, and Jerusalem, has created different types of Palestinians in terms of political, bureaucratical identity. Of course, the national identity is clearly very united, and we see this in the last couple of days, but has created a different 22 years old Palestinian. So I understand, and again, going back to the same point, I understand why a Palestinian in Jerusalem at the age of 22 will adopt a non-violent resistance, and you see that this is an attractive and a productive and an effective way. But I'm doubting that we can get to the same level, unfortunately, of a 22 years old guy in Gaza who lived all his life under siege, trying to promote the idea of him resisting non-violently. So this I don't want to call it delusion, but this is kind of a dream that the Palestinians just one day all around the world, including all historic Palestine, just going to wake up one day and adopt non-violent, is quite unrealistic, I think. And I don't know what this generation going to be in 5-6 years. Will they be promoted now to become leaders of the Palestinian society? I hope so. I don't know if we have a mechanism within the Palestinian political institutions now for young people to become leaders. Our leader is 86 years old, and we're waiting for a divine intervention now to change the president of Palestine or the president of the Palestinian Authority. So it's all up in the air, but we have to be honest. It is led by non-politicized people, especially in Jerusalem, non-politicized, non-party aligned young people.
Yudit, I want to give you the last word, and I want you're a Jewish Israeli, and I just want to know what would you say to Jewish Israelis about what they need to understand and what they need to do at this moment?
And can I just jump in 2 seconds? I'm going to have to leave at exactly in 2 minutes, so I will say goodbye if Yudit is still speaking when I have to leave. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Diala.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I would like to speak not as an Israeli, but as a West Jerusalemite. And if you ask me about the difference, I think there is a huge difference, because maybe we should talk a little bit about the urban situation in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is the biggest city, I wouldn't like to say in Israel, I would say in the region, okay? And the biggest Palestinian and Israeli urban communities live in Jerusalem, around 1 million people. 40% of them are Palestinians, 60% are Israelis. If I use the example that Mahmoud has just said about the Palestinian boy that has never met a Jew in his life, many Israelis have never met Palestinians in their life and if they met Palestinians in their life, they haven't met them in any meaningful way. And the only possibility for Israelis and Palestinians to meet and to engage in some way, and I know all the limitations, I live in the city, but at least to live in one space, the only place in which Israelis and Palestinians live in one space is Jerusalem. And so West Jerusalemites, whether they want to or not, are aware of the conflict in Jerusalem. And without idealizing the situation, because there is nothing ideal about it, at least they understand, I think I can say for the least that they understand the conflict in Jerusalem in a more complicated way than most Israelis. It doesn't always produce the most idealizing phenomena. For example, these racist march that we saw in Jerusalem about 3 or 4 weeks ago. It was, I'm not sure they were all Jerusalemite, but there were, majority of them were Haredi, and it was quite shocking, because that's a new, if we're talking about a new generation, that's a new generation of young people who know very little about the conflict, see the conflict in Jerusalem in a very fixed way of, Arabs are always there to kill us, and there are no roots for the conflict and no historical background for the conflict. But nevertheless, there is a growing, I think, Jewish civil society or Israeli civil society in West Jerusalem that are seeing the conflict in a much more complicated way, and seeking ways to reach out and to think about Jerusalem as a shared space. And maybe, sometimes we may feel that their views are too moderate, they take for granted Israeli rule, and I very much agree with my colleague, them, as long as the occupation remains, you cannot talk about equal communities in Jerusalem. It's not only a concept, it is manifested in so many ways that were discussed now. But in Iramim, we have thought about it a lot. And if you like to draw Israelis, and particularly West Jerusalemite, to think differently and more creatively, and Mahmoud said about fresh ideas about the conflict in Jerusalem in a way that can promote in some way, create better conditions for living together in Jerusalem at the moment and for a future and agreed upon solution. What do you say to young people? Do you say we need two-state solution, 2 capitals in Jerusalem, and they know that it is not coming any closer to us? And we say to them today, we say, think about Jerusalem as the home of 2 peoples. And it goes very much back into this attack on Palestinians' home, on Palestinian feeling that their very, very private and collective home in Jerusalem is under attack. If we think about Jerusalem as the home of 2 peoples, and in the most comprehensive way, what does it mean, home? It means that I also have, it's not only that I need food and shelter, I need also that my symbolic attachment to the city will be recognized, to my home will be recognized, my religious attachment to my home will be recognized, nationalist, national collective attachment to the city, to my home, to the city as my home should be recognized. But if we start from this concept of home, it's in a way appealing more to a particular civil society activists in East Jerusalem. And we do see, I know it's not enough, I know it doesn't necessarily answer all these huge questions raised and issues raised by my colleagues, but it's a start, and we have to start with some place. And today in West, there are lots of activists and activities and initiative in West Jerusalem trying to reach out some of these gaps, taking Arabic classes. Thousands are taking Arabic classes. By the way, both Hebrew classes and Arabic classes in Jerusalem are full, actually full. By trying also to, you see some of them also demonstrating in Sheikh Jarrah. They are the minorities, but there is a wide range of activities that if you compare with the rest of Israeli, you say something is happening in Jerusalem, in West Jerusalem, not enough, not enough political, but somehow a beginning. Jerusalem, and I believe that Mahmoud will agree with me on that. Jerusalem is definitely the core of the conflict in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but it can also be the key. We are not getting any near there, but we have to continue believing and to continue working on somehow creating that key from Jerusalem, from this huge urban space in which very big Palestinian and Israeli community are living together and will continue to be living side by side under any political constellation.
Thank you, Yudit. We're out of time. Thank you, Yudit Oppenheimer, so much. Thank you, Mahmoud Muna. Thank you to Deyala Shamas, who had to leave us just a couple of minutes early. Thank you to all of you for joining us for this conversation, and I hope everyone is safe and that we'll have the chance to continue this conversation in the future. Be well.